Watson here from UNEP. We're just welcoming you to the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. I'm just going to wait a few seconds until a few more people join us. So people are fast registering right now. And then we shall start. On your screen you should see our three presenters today. So we have Marielle, Roni and Paul. Welcome and thank you for taking part. And I'll just give everyone maybe 5 more seconds. Just so you know, we've got about 250 people registered for today's session, and I'm just going to ask Alba if she can hear me okay. So she's going to send me a little chat, hopefully. Great, awesome, thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone to our webinar 4 of the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. This is the second webinar in English, and it's the last of the series under the initiative. We've got some exciting speakers to hear from today, as you can see, aligned at the top of your screen perhaps, and we're really looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts on the topic of urban food systems in a changing climate. My name is Alison Watson, I'll be your moderator. Now, unfortunately I may have to leave a bit earlier than the end, so I'm ably helped and supported by my colleague at the International Urban Food Network, Alban Gaspar, and she's going to take over in that case. So just so you know, the accent will change possibly for the moderation through the course of the discussion, so don't be too shocked from a New Zealand to a French accent. You'll be very lucky. Okay, just to give you a little bit of help and housekeeping, I'm just going to show you what your screen looks like. Hopefully you've got a control panel there somewhere in your screen that looks like this, and you can use that if you want to keep that open all the time, because sometimes when you're not using it, it disappears. You can click the view menu and uncheck auto hide control panel, so that might be a good tip. Secondly, you'll be able to ask questions right throughout the whole presentation, and you can just write them in this box here, and Alban will probably respond with a quick sort of reply, and it may be an actual answer to your question if she can, or she may just say that we'll save that for one of the speakers. So after each speaker we'll have 1 or 2 questions, and at the end we'll have quite a lot of time for questions and answers. So we really want to encourage you to write your questions, and lots of questions, in that box. Just to note that today's presentation is being recorded and it will be provided at the end of the webinar series for you. Okay, a little bit of information about the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. There's lots of activities that we're doing, 4 webinars, and this is the last one. We're also producing some short films to highlight key messages around sustainable food systems, and also sustainable food systems in urban centres in a changing climate. And lastly, we're producing a policy perspectives paper, and you will be kept up to date with all of that information as it comes out. The initiative was launched by UNEP-IUFN and the Foundation Nikita Ulo in September this year, and the aim is really to raise awareness on the linkages between sustainable food systems, sustainable urban development and climate change. So we are extremely glad to be bringing you these webinars and the work which we think is extremely important in this today. And also with COP21 coming up, we think it's really important to provide some focus on these issues. So today's webinar is focusing on how cities can respond to climate change and the need for resilient, sustainable urban food systems. And we're going to get started with hearing from one of our first speakers. Just to reiterate, we have 3 speakers, and we'll have lots of time for question and answer sessions. So our first speaker is Roni Neff, and she's the assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Department of Environmental Health Sciences. She directs the program on food system environmental sustainability, and she's currently working with Baltimore City on a project to create a food system resilience plan Other work focuses include wasted food and protein consumption. So, Roni, I'm going to give you the screen. So I'm just going to give you the mic. If you can hear me now. I'm going to give Roni the microphone, and I'm going to take pictures off of Paul and Marielle. So thank you. We'll see you soon. And I'm going to give you the screen sharing ability. So if you just wait a short while, and I'll change presenter. And wait a minute, Roni, I'm just bringing up the, I might have to get Alban just to push the audio for me because it's not coming up. Okay.
Ready? Can you hear me? I'm going to assume that means I'm on. Hi everyone, my name is Roni Neff, and I'm going to present a sort of a case study of what we're doing in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States, as well as describe some implications beyond Baltimore City. So let me start with a little bit of background in terms of defining what we mean by resilience to sort of frame this webinar. And a lot of people, when they use the word, they may use it synonymously with sustainability or emergency response or food security. And so I want to share a definition which is the ability to absorb, respond to, or recover from and adapt more successfully to adverse events. And that's from the Institute of Medicine. And a way to think about it is that you have a sort of a level of pre-event community functioning, and then some disaster hits, and in the case of food systems it could be some fast-moving disaster like a flood or something like that, or it could be something more slow-moving like a drought that leads to very high food prices. And so the level of resistance in the community is basically how badly that community is going to be hit. And a community with high community functioning may have better resistance. And the resilience is the extent to which it bounces back and the sort of rate and shape of the way that it bounces back. So I hope that's a useful way of thinking about it. And what's key here is that you can't necessarily measure resilience or resistance in the absence of some event happening. What you're measuring is some combination of pre-event community functioning as well as the extent to which you've engaged in some kind of preparedness. And the preparation and planning is what I'm here to talk about today. So the work that we are doing came on the heels of a really excellent project that was done by the City of Baltimore that looked at a whole range of different hazards and developed this detailed plan, very beautiful community engaged process. And they looked at all kinds of systems from transportation to energy. And when it came to food, they kind of realized that this system was so complex that it would be difficult to review the whole food system and find a way to put it into this plan at the same time. So with food, they had some minor recommendations, and the recommendation was basically, let's develop a plan in the future. And that's where I come in. And it's really important to think about food systems when we think about climate change planning, and I think that there's actually very few cities that have started engaging in this. And so I'm really excited that so many of you have signed up for the webinar and that the webinar has been organized, because this is an area where we really need to be moving, both in high-income countries and in lower middle-income countries. So as we think about, as we started thinking about developing this project, we had some assets in our city. We had the previous planning project that we could build upon. We have the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, and this is a group that's housed within the city's, within the city government, and they have been guiding food policy in the city, doing a really fabulous job, bringing the city to the forefront of food system innovation, and working with a lot of people that are interested in food in the city. There are over 60 food system stakeholders that are networked together and meet regularly from private business to public to community-based organizations. And the mayor is very supportive. This is a picture of her. And she's very supportive of this work. And we have a city-university partnership, which again is me. Well, actually, it's much broader than me. There's a lot of partnerships going on between the city and the university, and between the city and our center, the Center for a Livable Future. And that's been going on for quite some time. So a little background on Baltimore. We are a relatively mid-sized city in the United States, about an hour from Washington, D.C. And we have about a quarter of the population is food insecure. About a quarter of the population lives in areas with low healthy food access, and tremendous inequalities. There's a 19-year life expectancy gap between some of the wealthiest neighborhoods and the lowest income neighborhoods. And into all this mix, when we had already started doing our work, came the Baltimore uprising, which you may have heard about in the international news. And this was in relationship to police brutality against African Americans. And there was some really positive protesting that got done as part of this, but unfortunately at some point it devolved into riots, which didn't last long but did significant damage to the city food system in some areas. And the city really came together to clean up afterwards. But the events, the whole thing revealed some vulnerabilities to our city food system, which have implications for looking at climate change and a lot of other factors. And these vulnerabilities, I think, apply to a lot of other cities. And the first thing was that there was no coordinated system for response. So there was a chain of command through the emergency management system in the city, but food was not part of it. And so that was one of the first steps, was to get ourselves, get the city incorporated into the emergency operations for the future. And then there was no system for when people were requesting food or the donations came flooding in. There was no system for organizing and distributing them, so that was a need to establish. There were no protections for the retail, and again, this is an area with some areas, with a city with a lot of really significant healthy food access problems. So even though the retail is private businesses, in some sense it's a really important community asset that may need to be protected. And so some of them had hired private security, but maybe the city should engage more directly in protecting them in times of crisis, as well as the food delivery trucks from the food bank and others. And there was a curfew that hindered the ability to make food deliveries, which often happen in the middle of the night. And these food businesses are operating on very tight margins, so loss of money for them, it can be really significant. So let me tell you about the planning that we're actually doing, both as a result of the uprising and the broader food system resilience plan. And the first key to it is community engagement. And so I really want to emphasize that it's essential to have engagement from the whole variety of stakeholders, from private business to community-based organizations, to health organizations, to the emergency food sector, farming. All those groups are going to have really important insights about what needs to be done, and their participation is needed, because once you've got a plan, they are essential to implementation. So we also did some background work reviewing other food system plans from other cities and localities that incorporated resilience, and we also reviewed emergency plans that incorporated food. And we'll be preparing those for sharing, but if anybody's interested in seeing those literature reviews, I'm also happy to share them. We collected some background information, and this city, we had already done a lot of this work, so we know, what we have the mapping available to inventory the assets and things like that. This is really important. So we are starting now, we're getting ready to start with a series of about 30 interviews with stakeholders throughout the food system. And there may be a lot of hazard mitigation going on privately that each of them may have been planning. So the key is that those aren't connected to each other. The city doesn't know about them. And so the power of what they're each doing can really be magnified by bringing them all together. We are focused on these 6 hazards. And so we will be doing a hazard assessment to look at sort of where specifically they could hit, and a vulnerability assessment in terms of what are the most significant food system vulnerabilities, whether it's damage to buildings, or if we lose electricity, you know, the checkout counters can't work, never mind the refrigeration system, damage to transport networks within and outside of the city, because you know, the factors that could hit a city's food system do not have to be within the city, and they don't even have to be near the city. They could be someplace where the food is being produced. Food or resource shortages and how that leads to price rises, food contamination. And then we're also looking at what happens if people can't travel, either due to transit system breakdown, so they can't get to where the food is, or if there's some kind of a reason that they become afraid of travel, whether due to riots or pandemic or whatever. And just as an example, so with flooding, you know, we'll have maps of where the floodplains are, and we'll match that with the food system infrastructure and with the most food insecure populations, and then look at concretely, so what can we do about that to protect these sites and assure access, and then how does that play out with the food system. Following what happened in April, emergency preparedness has been a top priority. And I want to highlight 3 additional things in addition to responding to the vulnerabilities that I spoke about a few minutes ago. And the first is that we're working to get together information that could be shared with communities about who to contact for food access, as well as about food safety. The city just got funding to develop a set of sites where emergency food and water could be stored in case of crisis. And then looking at regional cooperation with other counties and states nearby to address some of the challenges that might occur. So finally, we turn all that into a set of concrete strategies and actions, thinking about who implements each one, what it's going to take to get there. And there will also be a set of what's called no regret actions, which are things that, whether or not they respond to a specific concern and whether or not a disaster ever happens, although of course that's pretty likely to happen, but these are things that we need to do to strengthen the functioning of our food system in general, strengthen food access, food recovery programs, support for renewable energy, and strengthening the local and regional food supply. And then it's a process of implementation, maintenance, and evaluation. And just as I wrap up, I want to mention that we're doing some work that takes this beyond Baltimore City. So we are developing indicators for urban food system pre-event functioning and preparedness that we can use and that can also be shared with other cities around the world. We'll be sharing our framework. We're eager and excited to network with other cities that are doing this work. So that's another reason I'm excited to participate in this webinar. So not a lot of cities are yet doing work to strengthen their food systems resilience, and so it's really essential that we do it, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. And let me just thank the talk that I gave includes the essential contributions from our partners at the city and the Office of Sustainability and the Food Policy Initiative, as well as other partners, both academic and my research assistants. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Roni. That was extremely interesting. It's really good to have an actual example and see you and your team working through something with a whole multitude of stakeholders, and that was one of our questions from our audience today, was who are all the different stakeholders, and is it difficult to get the stakeholders together, do you think? What are the ways that you are doing that or can do that?
So the stakeholders are really varied, and so it is the, like I said, the community-based organizations, those involved in sort of providing food, like the supermarkets, the corner stores, restaurants, food trucks, any of them that can be mobilized, as well as the health organizations, institutional food programs, local farms, and then it's going broader than that. It could be insurance companies, it could be those distribution companies that are distributing food around. In terms of the challenge of getting engagement, there is a significant movement in the United States and North America of food policy councils that bring these stakeholders together, so they're already networked, and that really helps. You know, that means that we've already got this group together. So yeah.
Excellent. And you had a list of hazards as well that you'd chosen. How did you choose the hazards? I think, was it 7 or?
Yeah. So the first set of them came directly out of that DP3 plan that I mentioned, the disaster preparedness plan. They had a set of hazards that they focused on, and we determined that a few of them were a little less relevant to the food system, and so that's how we set those. And then following the uprising, we realized that we had to extend a little further to think about other types of hazards that could hit the food system, that some of which are connected to climate change but may not be quite as directly a result of climate change like a pandemic, but we need to be thinking about that as well.
Excellent. And one more question. You talked about you'd like to work with other cities and you're interested in what other cities are doing. Is there any other cities that you can name that you know that are doing work in this space? Yeah,
there's a number of them. Some of well, you'll hear about some of that during this from the other speakers, but within the United States, Boston, San Francisco, New York are doing some really innovative work. There's several cities in Canada like Toronto and Calgary. Those are some of the first ones that come to mind. I'm sure I'm missing some key ones.
Yes. No, that's good, thank you. Just some examples. Well, thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the next speaker's presentation, Marielle. And if you can just wait, Roni, and when we finish with the speakers or the presentations, we're going to have some time for questions and answers again. So if you can join us then.
Thank you.
That would be great. Now, I just want to tell everyone as well, we were to have one more speaker in this session, David Slutherwaite, but he couldn't be with us. Sorry, he couldn't be with us today because of challenges with technology. So we're going to record his session and make sure that you're all sent a copy as well, and it will be a very good background from his work as a writer on the last IPCC report on urban adaptation. So you will get a copy of that. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Marielle Duckling, and in fact I may not have pronounced that right, Marielle, sorry. You can correct me. She's the director of the RUAF Foundation, and that foundation has supported development of sustainable urban and peri-urban agriculture and resilient city region food systems in over 40 cities around the world. As climate change is increasingly affecting urban food supply as well as other urban systems and livelihoods, she's very much been focusing on the integration of urban food and agriculture into city climate change strategies. And I express a warm welcome. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, and I'm just going to give you the ability to be heard. And also just give you, I'm just going to change the screen, so you'll soon see an invitation to change screen. Let me have a look. Oops. Here we go, it's changing now. You should be able to click soon to accept to share your screen. Excellent. And can you speak, Marielle, just so I can hear you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I just can't see my own screen yet.
Okay. So if you go into your PowerPoint, now I can see your screen. If you go into your PowerPoint.
Okay. I can see myself.
Excellent. I can see you too. You're looking very nice. Right. If you go, do you want to load your PowerPoint?
Yes. If I know how. Sorry.
Just load the PowerPoint how you'd normally load it on your computer. So.
Okay. Sorry.
Perfect. No, that's perfect. And then it should come up. And then if you put it into full view. Great, and I can see that it looks good. So the floor is yours, or the speaker is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. Welcome to all of you who are listening. It's a pleasure for me to share a bit of the experiences of the RUAF Foundation and the work we've been doing. And I think this slide illustrates very much what Roni, the previous speaker, was talking about. What happens in case of a disaster, and this is a picture of Bangalore, of Bangkok, 2012. You might remind that from seeing on television when for a couple of days, yeah, there was so much flooding in the city and around the city. Roads were flooded, food industries, food distribution stores, so resulting food shortages in the city. Food prices increased 3 to 4 times, and the city also started looking at very quick response mechanisms. And one of the mechanisms they looked at was the existing urban and peri-urban agriculture, which I abbreviated as UPA, the urban agriculture gardens within the city, to see to what extent that served as a resilience mechanism and provided, for example, access to food to those who were growing, or to those yeah, within the social network around the gardens. And that raised the question with us in the first, to what extent are cities already aware of how potential climate change impacts and disasters can impact their food system? And secondly, if they have considered the role of urban and peri-urban agriculture, how they could promote that. And I will show in this presentation a couple of examples of how other cities have used urban agriculture as a climate response mechanism, and I'll show some data from research, which come from projects that we developed and which were supported on the one hand by UN Habitat in Nairobi, and the Climate Development Knowledge Initiative in the UK. Another reference was made in the IPCC report, the last report, where I think for the first time the issue of the relation between climate change and urban food security was explicitly mentioned. And it was stated that cities with a heavy reliance on food imports would be more significantly affected with regards to their urban food security. And secondly, within cities, the urban poor and vulnerable groups would be most affected by disruptions in food supply because of increasing food prices. So again, the question is, how can more localized production and through urban and peri-urban agriculture help reduce vulnerabilities of cities by reducing dependence on food imports, and help reduce vulnerability of households by diversifying their food and income sources. Based on a literature review on what we have read about the potential contributions of urban agriculture to climate change adaptation, we've seen that there's mention of reduced impacts of increasing temperatures or the urban heat island impact, for example, through productive trees, fruit trees, in dense urban settlements, rooftop gardens who can have an impact on lowering rooftop temperature and thus temperature in the apartments below the rooftop. There is scarce literature on the reduction for vulnerability to flooding by using potential flood risk zones, like the image on the right in Antananarivo in Madagascar, by productive use, water management and retainment systems, avoiding urbanization on those potential flood risk areas, so that food growing in the city can be a mechanism to reduce that type of vulnerability. There's also literature on the contributions of urban and peri-urban agriculture and forestry to city climate change mitigation, so to ensure the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel-based energy use. by reducing food transport, storage, and packaging, by growing food closer to where consumers eat it. Also by better recycling organic wastes and wastewater, as especially if waste is dumped on a landfill, there can be quite an amount of methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. But all the literature says that of course the impacts depend on the type of urban agriculture. Are we talking about, as I showed, rooftops? Are we talking about growing in floodplains? Are we talking about, as you see on the left-hand picture, urban, peri-urban greenbelts, so within the city region? Are we talking about small-scale backyard garden, etc.? It depends, of course, on the production systems and technologies used. So if you think of growing in a heated greenhouse in a colder climate, then maybe you reduce food transport, but you spend more energy in heating the greenhouse, which may cancel the other potential positive impacts. And it depends a lot on trade-offs. The issue of reduction of food transport is highly debated. In the previous webinars, we've also seen examples of that, and it was, amongst others, stated that in fact consumer transport is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and if consumers have to drive with their vehicle unloaded to a lot of different shops or farms to buy their food, that may offset again the benefits of localized production. To go from theory to more concrete examples, this is an example of a city in Sri Lanka. It is a medium-sized or a small city located about 25 kilometers from Colombo, the capital, and a city where a lot of people live that commute to Colombo every day for work. So it's a fast-growing city, but still with a kind of rural background and a large presence of agricultural areas. Vulnerability studies, as Roni also talked about, showed that climate change challenges in that context are increasing rainfall and flash rains, coupled to urbanization of low-lying agricultural lands, increasing flood risks, and also in the past flood incidences with related damages to infrastructure and to roads. At the same time, you see increasing dependence on food imports, either from rural areas like the north of the country or even outside the country, and increasing urban temperatures. So when we looked at what potentially could be grown in and around that city and what type of models could be promoted, the city decided to test two pilot models, and one is the productive use of abandoned former rice fields, which are located in flood areas, with salt-resistant rice varieties and mixed vegetables, as you can see on the left-hand picture. This is more in the peri-urban area of the city. And the other one is and that obviously relates to looking at potential reduction of flood risks. And the other one is more inside the city, where there's still quite large urban plots where people could practice more agroforestry type of space-intensive home gardening, which could be an answer to help reduce urban temperatures and reduce household income on buying food on the markets and their vulnerability to increasing food prices. Going from one end from Asia to another end of the world, and in Rosario in Argentina, second large city in Argentina. A temperate climate, but still they also have noted increased flood incidences over the past years. Likewise, increasing temperatures, and in December 2 years ago, there was, which is their summer, was a high temperature record and such a high demand on energy use that the whole air conditioning and cooling system in the city was had to shut down. and the city as well, because of urbanization on the one hand, and on shifting traditional vegetable growing to growing of soybeans, there's increasing dependence on food imports. So the response that the city came up with was, how can we protect the peri-urban green area around the city for local and regional food production? How can we promote productive urban green infrastructure? And how can we better integrate urban agriculture areas in watershed management? Or that is to say, how can we promote urban agriculture areas both along roadsides, on zones subject to flood risks, next to river borders, also productive rooftops to enhance rainwater infiltration and stormwater management. A third city, back to Asia, Kathmandu, a city with a densely built up area and a diminishing zone around the city or the different municipalities for food production. Kathmandu is highly vulnerable to disruptions in food supply. It's located, as you probably know, in a valley with only 2 or 3 access roads. If there's heavy rainfall, landslides, roads are blocked. And there's recent examples of that, which immediately also resulted in food price increases. Air pollution is a climate-related problem, and also linked to urban waste management. So the responses of the city were the promotion of rooftop gardens to enhance the amount of local production, and also see to what extent different types of crops could be grown that could help clean the air. In that case, non-edible crops, and look at how household waste and wastewater could be recycled into those rooftops. Apart from developing these pilot models, we also did some more scientific research to actually see if those projects would have impacts on climate change adaptation and mitigation. If we talk about temperature or lowering of the urban temperatures, the urban heat island, and both in Sri Lanka as well as in Rosario, that urban agriculture presence statistically lowered urban heat island effects in summer. And that means that the number of days that you needed air conditioning, which is called cooling days, was lower, and resulting energy demand for cooling was also significantly lower. Comparing an area with urban agriculture to a similar area without urban agriculture. And if you look at the projected temperature increase in the coming 25 years, then of course these differences will become even more significant, and the potential positive impact on energy reduction as well. We also looked at different types of urban agriculture, where we saw, for example, that even a small garden, 1,600 square meters, had similar temperature effects to that of a large garden or large public park of 2 or 3 hectares, which is a positive sign, because it means that even in dense settlements, by including smaller areas for food production or for agroforestry, you can already have significant impacts and reduce your demand for cooling energy. With regard to flood risks, we looked at different scenarios. So a scenario where the whole city or a whole neighborhood would be urbanized and the land would be covered under concrete, to a scenario where all the available land that you have would be maintained for green and food producing areas. And we saw that by urbanizing everything, this would lead to almost 5 times higher flood risks for the cities, while a scenario with increased green area would reduce flood risks with 0.72 times. And the latter means that there is no further expansion of drainage infrastructure needed, while in the first scenario, the city would need to invest in more drainage infrastructure, in larger drainage pipes, which are very costly and also disturbing because you have to cut up roads and lead off traffic for a specific time. We also looked at foot miles, in both of the cities, and we calculated the emissions in terms of CO2 output. If you, for example, would produce in Rosario all the potatoes that are now consumed in Rosario, if you would produce that locally, or if you would shift transport from truck transport to train. And it seems obvious that if all those potatoes were produced around the city in that peri-urban green belt, that you could save 95% of transport-related emissions, which equals the CO2 emissions of over 630 Argentinians. Using the pilot project and the research findings, all the 3 cities already advanced in policy uptake. So in Kasbewa and Sri Lanka, what they did was they zoned these productive flood zones, these productive former paddy lands in the city development plan to protect them for future use. They changed the Paddy Act, the Rice Act, which only allowed certain forms of production to new forms of productive use of flood zones, which are more economically viable. They integrated urban and peri-urban agriculture also in the biodiversity plan. And they provided new incentives for rainwater harvesting for households in the urban area to promote these agroforestry type of home gardens. In Kathmandu, the impacts of the rooftop gardens were as such that they now included that as a fixed component of the municipal budget, and that by the end of 2016 they decreed that 20% of all household rooftops in the city should be under production. I just have to say that this was a proposal from before the earthquake, and of course, after the earthquake, the timeline might need to be extended. In Rosario, what they did was they now choose tree species for in the city determined on not only their food production capacity, but also on the basis of the temperature impacts, which species have highest temperature impacts. They preserve 400 new hectares for peri-urban food production around the city. And they also support those peri-urban producers by signing guarantee sales agreements with restaurants. And lastly, these urban agriculture areas are now proposed as part of the watershed management to reduce potential flood risks. So my main messages are that climate change impacts are increasing, and cities need to look at the impacts on their food systems, and may consider, next to other strategies that were also mentioned by the previous speaker, of localized food production. The second message is that there are already these and also other cities that promote different types of urban agriculture and peri-urban agriculture, and these could serve as models. And so far, investments in urban agriculture and green infrastructure have proven to be more cost-effective than other conventional approaches, like amplification of the drainage systems. And thirdly, that local national governments need to integrate these strategies into their zoning plans, land use plans, and climate change strategies. And if you want to read more, please look at these 2 website addresses and the different type of publications on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marielle. That was extremely interesting. What I really liked was the variety of examples and cities, diverse cities across the world. And it's very interesting to have that developing country city perspective as well, particularly where population growth is going to occur in the next 30, 50 years. It's very important to have that perspective in the discussion. I have a question for you. Do you see more demand from cities to work on these issues, for example, with yourselves or others? I know you have examples there, but is that demand increasing, do you think? from cities
yes,
approaching it?
The demand has been increasing for the past 3-4 years because of this increasing awareness of cities on climate change impacts and the links to food security. So they're looking for alternative strategies which are of course of lower cost, but which also have additional benefits like food production, food security, local economic employment if people sell part of the production, social inclusion. And at the same time, there is an increasing demand of cities to look at urban food systems and resilient urban food systems per se. And listeners may know of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which was signed on the 15th of October by 115 cities around the world, committing themselves to, and Baltimore was one of them, committing themselves to develop a more resilient urban food system. And one of the links that was made in the pact was towards climate resilience. So both from the climate side as well as from the urban food system side, I think cities are bringing the two things together and are increasingly interested in learning and sharing experiences, in doing research, in applying projects.
Excellent. And another question that we have from one of our listeners is, you mentioned that the urban poor are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. In these cases where you're presenting, are the people taking on the activity by themselves, or is it something that is suggested? In other words, is it a top-down approach, or are you building a bottom-up approach, and how with stakeholders?
It's actually a combination of both. In all the cities there were already groups, including urban poor and vulnerable groups, practicing those systems. For example, rooftop gardening in Kathmandu was already happening by women groups. In the Rosario, the peri-urban production was already by small-scale producers. In Kesbeba in Sri Lanka, there was already a large group of households already practicing these agroforestry types of systems. So what we try to bring together is more top-down or more government and other stakeholder, NGO and research support to expand those systems. So make sure that more households can benefit and to support those systems. So for example, in Kathmandu, we had maybe 50 women working, and because of the government support now, over the past year, another 1,000 households have been trained to also implement those systems.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And one more quick question is, you mentioned potatoes, and you were looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of locally produced potatoes versus those that are transported from further afield. When you did that, did you consider the whole greenhouse gas footprint of, or the whole footprint of the potato, or did you just look at the transport?
We did not compare, I have to say, greenhouse gas emissions related to production. So we didn't compare the production system in the location where they come from now to the potential production system locally. The assumption was made based on agronomist knowledge that those systems would be quite similar. What we did look at was the whole transport system. We did look at type of vehicles. We did look at cold storage. We did look at vehicle loads and return loads. And we did look at food waste generated along the whole chain.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Now, if you would kindly wait to the end where we've got probably some more good questions for you, that would be appreciated. And thank you for your presentation. And I'd like to introduce Paul Burton now. So we'll hear from you later, hopefully, Marielle.
Sure.
Thank you. And Paul, I'm going to give you the power to show your presentation. So I'm just going to enable that now, and I'm going to just unmute you, so it may take a little while. That looks like it's coming up.
Yep.
And Paul, you can choose to be seen or not. It's very early in the morning, everyone, for Paul. He's in Australia, so it's around 1:30 or something in the morning. So thank you for waking up or staying awake to be with us today.
That's okay. What do I click so that I can see what? Share my webcam. Yep.
I think I've just, yep, there we go.
Yep.
Great, we can see you. You're looking awesome, so.
You ready for me to start?
Now, yeah, well, Paul, I was going to give you an introduction, but look, we're a little bit tight on time, and I really want to get to the questions. So maybe you could give yourself a brief introduction and then move in.
Sure.
But I think that would be good. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm Paul Burton. I'm currently the Acting Director of the Urban Research Programme at Griffith University, which is based mainly in Brisbane and the city of Gold Coast, which is in the southeast corner of Queensland in Australia. What I'm going to talk about now is based on some research that I did, completed a couple of years ago and was published in 2013, which is this work, which was looking at urban food security, urban resilience and climate change, and we carried out that research with the support of NCARF, the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, which is a government, principally as a federal government funded research body led by Professor Jean Polutikoff and actually based at Griffith University but autonomous of us. So they commissioned a number of studies and commissioned from me some work on urban food security, urban resilience and climate change. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And there's a bit of an overview. I won't dwell on those now. I'll just go straight into them. Actually, what I would say, just by way of introduction, is that I'm talking primarily about Australia, and Australia is something of a special case. It's a country with one of the highest per capita CO2 emission profiles in the world. It's a relatively wealthy country. It's also a country that has been for some time and remains committed to the mining and the export of coal, not only for economic reasons, but because it believes, our government believes that we have a moral obligation to help the poor of the developing countries of India and China in particular by selling them our coal as a primary source of power. It's a country where climate policy for the last 10 years has been a very contentious issue and has seen the overthrow of at least 2 prime ministers. We're getting rid of our prime ministers at a rather rapid rate at present, and that has been associated with their stance on climate policy. We're also a country that's very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change through inland flooding, through sea level rise, through droughts, through bushfires, through vector-borne diseases. The full range of impacts we know impact especially heavily in Australia. And one of the reasons it impacts heavily in Australia is that we are also a highly urbanized country. Now we have a rather low bar when it comes to defining urban areas in Australia, but basically about 90% of the population of Australia lives in large towns and cities, and most of those are located on the coast in vulnerable coastal areas. So in terms of food security and food policy, I would say that Australia is a country that's characterised by surpluses and by complacency. We've long produced agricultural surpluses and exported those surpluses. We don't see typically food security as a problem within Australia. If anything, we tend to take the view that we can make a contribution to improving food security globally through exporting our surpluses. So that's a common perception. There is little perception that we have problems of food supply in Australia as a whole, because that is the case at present. There are some localised problems, certainly some remote communities in the north of the country will be areas where fresh fruit and vegetables are very expensive, partly because even if some may be grown locally, they will be shipped down to the south, processed and re-exported back at great cost. We also find that in some parts of our cities, I don't think it would be fair to say that we have food deserts, but there are certainly areas, and I would suggest there are growing areas where the food that's available in shops is highly processed fast food rather than fresh fruit and vegetables. So in an increasing number of the low-density suburbs that characterise Australian cities, you would have to travel past a lot of fast food outlets in order to get to a shop selling fresh fruit and vegetables, and it will often be a lot cheaper to buy a bucket of deep-fried chicken than it would be to buy fresh fruit and vegetables. The shelves in our supermarkets are pretty much always full, and therefore there's a view that we have little, therefore, to worry about. That's partly a result of our distribution systems. We're dependent on distribution systems that are increasingly globalized. So I think I said we're a net exporter of fresh food. We're increasingly importing processed foods. So although we are at the centre of these increasingly complex global food distribution systems, those are actually quite resilient, and we haven't yet experienced serious disruptions to those global food chains. That's not to say that we're not exposed to risk, but at present we haven't been particularly badly affected, and that I think tends to kind of feed into our overall sense of complacency. There is, however, a growing interest in food, in particular in the quality and the provenance of food, and also in locally produced food, so local produce, but also in local production systems. If anything, it's a rediscovery or a reawakening of our interest in systems that were, as I'm sure is the case in many other parts of the world, were commonplace 1 or certainly 2 generations ago, when a significant proportion of the fresh produce consumed within cities would have been produced within the greater metropolitan areas. So we've kind of lost, if you like, an awareness of that, and are slowly rediscovering it. There's a growing awakening of interest in that. It tends to be a concern and a preoccupation with domestic food production. Backyard gardening, we are essentially a suburban nation, and although our backyards are getting smaller, there's still capacity to grow food there, and that tends to dominate public discussion rather than the opportunities for commercial food production within metropolitan regions. If we look in terms of urban policy more broadly and think about vulnerability and resilience, there's an increasing, very recently, an increasing attention being given to cities. We changed as a result not of a general election but an internal bloodless coup, a new Prime Minister about a month ago, and one of his first announcements was that he would create a new minister, the position of a minister for cities. First time we've had one of those for a very long time. So there's a very welcome new focus on cities, and a lot of the policy debate around that is around vulnerability and resilience. Vulnerability to that kind of standard range of external existential threats, such including climate change, including economic and fiscal crisis. We thought we suffered quite badly in Australia, but my view is that in comparison with many other parts of the world, we got off very lightly. Wars and conflict, which aren't yet things on our doorstep, but could well be in the future, and what are seen as a threat of population growth. Australia is a very large country, but has a relatively small population, total population of about 24 million. Some projections say we might double by the middle of the coming century, and for some that would spell a serious problem in terms of the carrying capacity of the country, but whether we're willing and able to do anything about that population change is another matter. So one of the, as well as having a new emphasis on cities and urban policy, we can now again, I think, with the new Prime Minister and some new state premiers, begin to talk about climate change again. For the last 2 or 3 years, those were words that nobody interested in their careers uttered very loudly. But I would have to say that apart from in very limited cases, there's very little discussion about food and food policy. So the kind of policy responses around food that we see in Australia are framed by what I said at the outset. In other words, it's about national surpluses and the export, the profitable export of those surpluses. There is a view that the north of the country, and this is partly related to perception of climate change and in particular the impact of drought on some of the traditional areas where we have grown food up until now and will continue but to do so in the future, but in increasingly constrained circumstances. The north is seen as an area of, the north of the country is seen as an area of great potential because it's basically because it's wet and because of its proximity to the markets of Southeast Asia. So it is seen as a place where we can grow more food and sell it profitably to the north. Policy debates around food tend to ignore some significant conflicts around land. So as has already been mentioned, I think by Marielle, one of our particular challenges, but a relatively unacknowledged and unrecognised one, is about the expansion of our cities through peri-urban, suburban residential growth and subdivisions, and that is often and typically on relatively high-grade agricultural land that previously would have been used for kind of intensive market gardening and small-scale commercial food production. Slightly further afield, we're seeing some very interesting political conflict now around mining on agricultural land, so both coal mining and coal seam gas exploration. The system we have here is that whilst I might own a piece of land, I don't own the right to mine what's under that land, and licenses to explore and to mine can and are given by state governments to anyone they choose to give those licenses to. So apart from compensating me, I as a landowner, and in particular say a farmer, have no absolute right to block that, and that's increasing and is becoming an increasingly serious source of political tension. There's also debate around foreign investment, mainly framed as a kind of xenophobic response to what is seen as somewhat kind of aggressive and nefarious Chinese investment in Australian agriculture. If you imagine the kind of places that are being invested in, they are very large, often cattle stations, and these are huge, absolutely huge. I mean, cattle stations that might be the size of France. There's quite a bit of foreign investment. Actually, if you look at the profiles, most foreign investment in agriculture continues to come from the UK and New Zealand, but as I said, it's framed as a challenge of Chinese inward investment. And I guess there's a kind of ambivalence towards urban agriculture. It's seen as a slightly faddish middle-class preoccupation that would have a marginal impact on overall food systems. I think that view is changing slowly, not least because of the work of some interesting projects looking at small-scale, intensive commercial production as well as domestic production. So what I'll just do now is give you just a couple of instances of vulnerability and trying to build resilience to close with. The first takes us back a few years to Brisbane, 2011, when we experienced some of the most severe flooding that had been seen. I mean, this is a country of floods and drought, so we're used to floods, but the flooding experience in Brisbane in 2011 was unprecedented. And in Brisbane and certainly some other small towns around the area, there were a number of people died as a result of these floods. Also, what happened and what this photograph illustrates is that the flooding took out some key bits of infrastructure, and what you can see underwater here is something called the Rockley Food Market, which is based in the city of Brisbane and which serves as the principal food distribution node for the whole of southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales. I should tell you that the total population of Queensland, I think it's about 85% live in the southeast corner, so it's a very large state, the vast majority of which is unpopulated or very sparsely populated, and we're all crowded into the southeast corner. The Rockley markets served as the main distribution point for fresh fruit and vegetables for that region. And in 2011, for about a week, it was underwater, which meant that no food came in or out of that node. Which meant that within 24 hours, all the supermarkets in that greater southeast Queensland region had no fresh produce on their shelves, and by the end of the week, they had very little packaged food either. So for a week or so in 2011, we became very conscious of what happens in our highly sophisticated and what we had previously thought was very resilient food distribution system when it goes underwater. We realized that there are no alternative sources of supply, so we just had to sit it out and wait for the flood waters to subside and the Rockley market to get back in action. That took about a week. The response to that, unfortunately, I would have to say, is that after it was cleaned up, there was some very marginal work done to improve its flood resilience in the future, but essentially it remains. There was some discussion about whether the whole market should be moved to an area that was less flood prone, but it was decided that because significant investment had been made within the last decade, that was impractical and unfeasible, economically unfeasible, and therefore it continues to serve that function in that location. So the next time we're hit by a similar flood, and we will be, and we know that because of climate change, the interval between before the next major flooding event like this will probably be shorter than it was the last time. We will experience the same problems. So in a sense, we are no less vulnerable than we were at the end of 2010 in this regard. It did start to focus some people's attention on building greater local and decentralized systems, but very little has happened by way of policy action from either the state government or local governments in Queensland. The second and rather more optimistic case that I'll mention just very briefly is what the City of Melbourne has been doing to develop its food policy. Now, the thing you need to understand about Australian local governments and somewhere like the City of Melbourne is that the City of Melbourne in fact covers only a very small part of the Greater Melbourne metropolitan area. It in fact only covers the central business district. So the whole of Melbourne is covered by a network of about, I think it's about 35 local governments. So the City of Melbourne in this respect doesn't refer to the Greater Melbourne area. There is no statutory local government entity that is responsible for the whole of the metropolitan area of Melbourne. There has been in the past, but there isn't at present. So the food policy here is that of one small part of that urban system. City of Melbourne is in the state of Victoria. The state of Victoria, I would say, is the state that has done most in terms of thinking about and developing innovative food policy work over the last 10 to 15 years, and other local governments in the Melbourne metropolitan area and the City of Melbourne have been, I would say, at the forefront of some of that policy action in comparison to the rest of Australia. So what they are trying to encapsulate in this strategy, and I would have to say that I don't think it compares. I mean, it's a fantastic initiative and it should be applauded and welcomed, but I don't think it's as systematic or as influential as the plan that Roni was talking about, or that exists in some other cities, certainly of equivalent kind of places in cities of North America, USA or Canada. Nevertheless, what it does is it looks at land uses and tries to use the planning regime to look favourably on food production opportunities within the city. It does some relatively minor but nevertheless symbolically important work on planting of trees. They've got a fantastic policy for planting thousands of trees throughout the city of Melbourne, and increasingly they will look at fruit trees to plant, so trees that produce things that we can eat as well as that have other eco-services benefits. Food is recognised as an important element of local economic development, so the potential for growing, processing, supplying and consuming food is seen as a significant part of what Melbourne City is about and what makes it, as the Lord Mayor will remind you on every occasion, that the often voted world's most livable city. And there's recognition also of the health benefits of both growing and eating more locally produced food. So City of Melbourne and a few other places in Victoria and a few other cities around the country, or local government areas around the country, are starting to do some things, but I would say it's by no means a significant aspect of local government generally, or even state government policy making in Australia.
Hi Paul, it's Alison here. We'll just have to. Your three main messages, great.
Well, so my conclusions are that I mean Australia is a country that is, and it sees itself as food secure, and therefore is a relatively complacent place. It sees its economic future as one that might replace the export of minerals with the export of beef and cereals and other products to Southeast Asia in particular. We can be provoked into policy responses on the back of kind of shocks and external threats such as bushfires and major floods and droughts, but we tend to forget those lessons rather quickly. And my overall conclusion, using a bit of Australian vernacular that Alison can explain to you if necessary, is that if we fail to be provoked properly and seriously by these things, then in the long run we may well be rooted. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's extremely interesting to see it from an Australian perspective, and I guess I've got one one or two questions maybe mixed up in the one question, is that you talk about this complacency, framed by complacency, provoked by shocks, but how do you think that complacency is going to change, or how do you change that that perception that there's no problem or that there's no need to do anything? Because as you point out, Australia is actually highly vulnerable, and I think that picture of the Brisbane food market was extremely shocking and a very good message to sort of say, well, these things are going to happen and they're serious. How do we do stuff?
Well, I think it is to. I see very little evidence that that governments at all levels, federal, state, and local, are willing yet to do systematic long-term planning for those existential threats, including climate change and future economic crises and population growth and so on, without being provoked by, not quite random, but somewhat kind of unanticipated or unpredictable shocks to the system. So I think that it seems to me that it's only on those occasions that we go, oh gosh, we really ought to think about doing something differently. My concern is that the shock value dissipates rather quickly, and that if typically we'll get back to kind of business as usual fairly quickly. So Brisbane was cleaned up by and large within a month or so. I mean, there were individuals whose houses were severely damaged, and they're probably still suffering and economically from the consequences. Bushfire-prone areas that have been destroyed, get to build back, and there's a bit of build back better mentality, but in a way that's a good illustration. So one of the what I found slightly disturbing responses to the Victorian bushfires of a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Gillard, an otherwise sensible person, her immediate response was, we will not be defeated by Mother Nature, we will build back. No, there was no suggestion that it might not actually be a sensible thing to allow continued building of settlements in bushfire-prone areas, in forests that might be very pleasant to look at, to live in most of the time, but when they go up in flames, that's the end of things. Or to be building in what are already flood-prone areas and are likely to become more flood-prone areas. The debate, in my experience, is still, it's something that's going to happen a long way off, and we can't really worry about that now, and there should be no interference with our property rights. So if I want to build on the beachfront, then you don't have a right to stop me. If I then suffer because of a flood and an inundation, I'd like you to come and help me out and to compensate me, and I'd like some compensation.
Okay, I'm just going to ask, sorry.
Way behind you trying to stop me build here in the first place.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. I'm just going to ask Roni and Marielle and bring them into the conversation. Roni, I'm just going to enable you to be heard. I'm just unmuting your microphone, and Marielle will as well. And I'm just going to ask Roni, how important then is it, like leadership, for example, within the City Council or within these food policy groups at driving responses for adaptation? For example, you've got a case where it's very complacent, perhaps in Australia, in some parts of Australia. You're doing a lot of work, and it seems the city is increasingly interested in being more resilient and prepared. How important is it that for leadership or a couple of people to drive this?
That's a great question, and I would say that we're not immune from the complacency either. That's a very strong factor here as well. I think that the broad planning that happened was part of a requirement. I don't remember the specifics, but there was some national funding, something like that, that cities had to do this kind of planning. And then the follow-on, the type of food policy planning that we're working on is, I'd say, sort of idiosyncratic of a few, particularly the person that led that effort who really saw this as a need and was passionate about it and reached out and made it happen. And so we're doing it, and it's partly because I got excited about it and wanted to do it, but I'm not part of the city government, so.
Yeah. So I think having those people that are excited about the work is always a big part of any sort of initiative to make it successful and get the momentum going. Is that the same that you see, Marielle, in some of the cities that you're working with, that it's a couple of people sometimes that are really involved that bring other people along?
Yes, I mean, our experience is that you always need a champion, and doesn't really matter where that champion comes from which type of department. The importance is that it's a champion that can link up to higher level government makers, so to the mayor or to the city council, as well as can link up to other staff within the municipality, other sectoral departments, as well as can link up with multi-stakeholders. And we do see in each of the cities, like in Kathmandu, it was somebody from the Department of Environment. In Rosario, it was a combination of people from social development and from climate change. In Kesbewa, it was even the provincial government and not the local government that started the discussion, because they're responsible for all the urban councils within the province. So depending on the situation, you need that champion to connect up to all the other stakeholders.
Which speaks to the benefit of some kind of targeted outreach to people that are situated in the right place to do this in various cities around the world, to maybe think about how we could organize something like that to raise their level of concern and interest.
I think that's crucial. I think I'm not sure what the situation is, or I'm sure it's very varied in North America and in European countries as well, but local government in Australia is not particularly strong. One or two local governments are relatively powerful because of their size, but most are small, have very few resources and very limited capacity to do anything other than their kind of core business of providing basic services. But I think some of the bigger councils, places like the City of Melbourne, the City of Sydney, are increasingly joining up with international networks of mayors, city mayors, and I think that's where you can get some traction, because they go to international conferences, they learn that what they might have thought was a slightly kind of, as I said, quirky, faddish policy area at home is perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, and mayors of perfectly respectable cities elsewhere are doing this as a matter of course. So they come back and they go, oh, it's not weird and cranky. It's actually very sensible, and it's it's good for business. It makes sense on a number of fronts, and actually, yes, I'm willing to do that now. I mean, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, he's a conservative politician, but he makes he's allowed that food policy to develop, but he takes a really strong stand on climate change. Now, a lot of his fellow conservative mayors, will stand up and say, as one of our former prime ministers did, the science of climate change is crap, and I don't want anything to do with it. So.
Okay. So just a quick question, because we're running out of time, and I want to ask each of you, and I did give you some warning for this, but if I came along and said I've got some funding and I would like to give it to you, and I'd like you to choose something in this area of work that you think really needs a lot of focus and priority, what would you spend it on? And I'll start with Marielle. It has to be quite quick, so you
Okay.
go for it.
Okay, I would, in a larger number of cities, I would continue testing these different and more urban and peri-urban agriculture types of models and their different climate change impacts. And I would provide advice to the larger number of cities which are out there who want to integrate this in their city climate change strategies and give them a whole package, not only of technologies and production systems, but also of multi-stakeholder processes on to what policy areas to link it, on how to integrate it in a disaster risk reduction and food emergency plan, and yeah, answer to the needs of all the cities in the global south out there who want to work on this topic.
Excellent, thank you very much. Roni, it's your go now.
Okay, well, I'll support that too, but since it's a big pot of money, I can do even more. So I'm going to go forward with the planning piece and suggest that if there was some kind of a template that was created that cities could use to develop this at a relatively low resource level of impact, to develop a concrete plan for how they're going to respond to some of these things, and then give seed funding to cities all around the world to customize this and develop it for their own cities with a lot of public participation.
Excellent, that sounds great. And Paul, you've got a limited amount of time, but tell us your idea with your priority setting.
I wouldn't know how to do it myself, but I'm sure I could find somebody to do it. But it would be to model supply chains and distribution systems for different cities, and in particular to look at the impact of disruptions to those systems. So you know, a bit like the Brisbane case, you know, what happens when you take out a key distribution node? What happens if you're totally dependent on a rail network and you know, there's a big crash and the rail system goes down for a day? What happens? So what happens, what its spatial patterns are, and the temporal side as well. How long? Because I think, you know, we're operating in just-in-time production systems. You know, supermarkets are stocking on a 24-hour or 12-hour cycle. You know, so any disruption, you see it on the shelves very quickly. And certainly in Australia, you know, if the main, we've only got 2 main supermarket chains. If they're out of action, that's it. There's no alternative.
Yes.
So mapping those systems and their vulnerabilities, I think, would be very interesting, because that might make some of the politicians and policymakers pay a bit more attention to the vulnerability of the system as a whole.
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much to all three of you. They're extremely interesting and very varied and diverse perspectives on the issue, and I think that's what's needed, because food systems, wherever they be, whether whatever city they're in, or urban-rural mix of food systems, they're very diverse, and you need to bring different perspectives to the table. But I think something that stood out was this need to work with stakeholders to understand the problems better, to actually bring the food discussion, the food system, into decision making around urban planning, and that climate change is going to have some serious impacts on the food system, and we need to be prepared for that in many ways. So I just want to just say thank you to all those speakers. Thank you to all of you who are listening and have participated. We haven't answered all your questions, but we will try to answer those questions and discuss with our presenters how to get back to you on those with some more information. So I'm just going to end the webinar now, and I wish you all a very good night, or a very good morning, and a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.